Today I wanted to share from the story of Daniel. The prophet Daniel, believe it or not, was a vegetarian. We do have records that, at least for a part of his life, Daniel was a vegetarian. I think this is something a lot of people just kind of skip over. It's one of the first things that comes to my mind when I share with people that I'm a vegetarian, and they immediately start asking questions about my health. Sometimes, if I complain about being tired or not having very much energy, people can assume, well, the reason for that is because you're vegetarian. It's not because you're sick or because you're not sleeping well. It's because you're vegetarian, obviously. So I get a little frustrated when people react like that. The only reason why you would not feel 100% is because you're not eating meat. So the book of Daniel reads, or at least starts out, more like a history book than anything else. It's not just a story. It doesn't read like a mythology does, because the very first sentence in this book is, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. So that's very specific. It's a specific moment in time when this happened. And it was a fact that Jerusalem was besieged by the king of Babylon. We know that. It's in our historical records. We don't have to doubt this. King Nebuchadnezzar had already conquered many other kingdoms, many other places, and Israel was just another one on the list. Babylon was a very corrupt kingdom, very corrupt place, very evil. They did some terrible things, things that we would be appalled by today. But God used this empire, and specifically the Emperor Nebuchadnezzar, in order to discipline and punish the kingdom of Judah and his people, the Jews. And God wanted to discipline them because they had been disobedient to him. They were not following his laws. They were ignoring him. They were worshiping other gods. In order to get Israel and Judah back on the right path, God disciplined them, and he used Babylon in order to do that. Babylon came, took all of the people, removed them from their land, and essentially just deported them. So they became prisoners of war. They went into captivity. They became slaves. Many people fled to Egypt to escape Babylon, but one way or another, all of the Israelites had to leave their country, had to leave their home. This is what happened to Daniel. When Nebuchadnezzar finally conquered Jerusalem, he gave some orders that people from the royal family and the nobility from the higher classes in Judah would be taken to his capital, and that they would be assimilated into Babylonian culture. They would be taught the Babylonian language. They would be given Babylonian names. They would be taught how to worship the Babylonian gods. So it says, the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. So the Chaldeans are the people who live in Babylon. It continues, the king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. Daniel and his 3 friends were among this group that were taken into exile and removed to Babylon. And they were selected to enter the king's palace. They lived a bit of a comfortable life. The king provided for everything that they needed, and they were put into school, basically, to become like the Babylonians. The main idea here is that Daniel was part of this privileged elite group. And then it continues. They were given new names, Babylonian names, And then in verse 8, it says, "But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself." This is confusing. So here he is with all of this privilege. He has decided within himself that he does not want to be defiled. He does not want to be corrupted by the Babylonians, by Nebuchadnezzar. What does that mean? How do you get defiled? Especially by eating the food and drinking the wine from the king, the king has the best of the best. How could that be bad? Well, the Israelites, the Jews, were given certain laws and commandments from God about what they could and could not eat or drink. Most likely, any meat that the king was eating was a sacrifice to one of the Babylonian gods. Most likely, these were also animals that the Jews were commanded not to eat. It's very, very specific what they were allowed to eat and not to eat. Some of the reasons for that were these things they were not allowed to eat are animals that often carry diseases and parasites. They weren't safe to eat, and God knew that. The people back then probably didn't. Instead of just giving in to this pressure, giving in to the oppression of the Babylonians, Daniel decided he was going to follow his God no matter what. Even though he had been removed from his country, from his home, he was going to continue following God and obey him in everything that he commanded. The story continues in verse 9. "And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, 'I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king.'" This guy who's in charge of these exiled prisoners was saying, hey, if you start to get sick, or you're weaker than the rest of the people, my king is going to blame me. How can I let you not eat and not drink if it could be my life on the line, But God gave Daniel favor with him. It says, "Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Test your servants for 10 days. Just 10 days. That's not too bad. That's a short amount of time. Test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Replace the sacrificed meat with vegetables. Replace the wine with water. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see." He said, give us vegetables and water, and then at the end of 10 days, if we're worse off, then fine, we'll eat the king's food and we'll drink the king's wine. But if we're not worse off, then, what's the problem? So what happened? Let's see. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. Wow! The complete opposite happened than what the chief of the eunuchs was expecting. In fact, they actually thrived. They did better without it, And part of the reason was because they were obeying God. They were following what God had told them to do. It turns out what God wants is actually the best for us, Even when we can't understand it, even when it totally is contrary to what we would expect. And that's really true in so many things of life. God knows better than us. Wow, isn't that a surprise? Daniel continued to grow, and his friends too. They actually surpassed all of their peers. So in verse 18 it says, "At the end of the time when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. These are the vegetarians! And they did better. They were more successful than all the rest. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all of his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. So that's the end of chapter 1 in the book of Daniel. Not only did Daniel and his friends do better physically, but they were also doing better mentally. I'm inspired by the life of Daniel and how he chose to be obedient to God, even when everything was saying he shouldn't, and even when he was surrounded by so much pressure, when he was living in a society that ignored God and had no respect for God. Daniel and his friends persevered, they endured, and they said, no, we will remain faithful and obedient to our God, to who we know is true, who we choose to serve. So I try to be like that. It's hard. It's definitely hard. And sometimes, there's easier choices. It's inconvenient to obey God sometimes. But in my experience, it's always turned out for the best. Yeah, I've never regretted it. Anyways, I wanted to share that story, and I hope that it inspires someone somewhere